My name is Nikki Castlefield, and this is the News at 10 on Northern News Network. Tonight's top story unfolds as the British Empire finally comes to an end with the handover of Britain's final colony in Hong Kong back to the People's Republic of China. The lease over the new territories was taken for 99 years in 1898, after Britain outgrew Hong Kong and Kowloon, which it had conquered in the Opium Wars. The negotiations for the return of the colony led to the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which guaranteed democracy and capitalism in Hong Kong under China's communist system for at least 50 years. In other news, NASA has launched its landmark STS-94 space shuttle into orbit in a rerun of April's failed STS-93 launch. The shuttle took off with 7 crew members and a microgravity sciences lab earlier today from Cape Canaveral. In Europe, political upheaval continues as part of the former Eastern Bloc hold their first democratic elections in decades. Albanian people flocked to the polls recently to decide whether to restore the monarchy after the collapse of communism in the nation. Almost 2/3 of voters said no, a result the royal family had strongly disputed. The foundation of an Albanian republic is underway. That's all for now. My name is Nikki Castlefield on News at 10, and this is Northern News Network. Good night.
That was News at 10 with Nikki Castlefield. Next on Northern News Network, a documentary about the empire on which the sun never set. After the break.
I love crushing vans. I love exploring caves. I love crushing my enemies deep in the forest. I love Sunny PlayStation. What are you waiting for? Afraid you're gonna get beat by a girl?
Listen to the latest hits from the one and only King of Pop, Michael Jackson, in his new hit album, Blood on the Dance Floor. Listen to hot tracks such as Earth Song, Stranger in Moscow, and Morphine, out now at a record store near you. In the long and storied history of humanity, few empires have ever rivaled the reach and grandeur of the British Empire. This vast network of colonies across land and sea proved a feat of commerce and conquest, propelled by Britain's industrial might. But beneath the veneer of glory, cracks emerged from the unsustainable costs of maintaining such a colossal empire, in both material and human resources. Today we cover the slow retreat of Britain to its home islands from what was once the empire on which the sun never set. (1921). Britain is at its zenith following its victory in the First World War. It controls all of the Earth's seas and almost a quarter of its landmass. 444 million people find themselves under the control of the largest and most powerful empire to have ever existed, until 1922. Ireland had spent centuries suffering with discrimination, famine and war under the control of the English and later the British. After a failed uprising in 1916 and conflict throughout the early 1920s, Ireland was finally granted its independence, the first of Britain's dominoes yet to fall. That same year, Egypt would proclaim its formal independence, though Britain would keep its troops in the country. The following year, the newly established Turkish Republic under the control of Ataturk defies all expectations and defeats the European powers who has invaded it from all sides. Britain and its allies are forced to give up their claims in parts of the former Ottoman Empire. Turkish victory here would serve as a blueprint for other colonies' fight for freedom. Fast forward to 1926 and Britain issues the Balfour Declaration, devolving power to all its white settler colonies. Canada, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia are given an unprecedented level of autonomy and even begin to administer some of Britain's other nearby colonies, streaming governance of these territories whilst keeping them in the orbit of London. Inspired by the success of nearby Egypt and Turkey, Iraq slowly decouples itself from Britain and declares its independence in 1932. The new country would pivot towards the emerging Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan over the coming years. In Europe, Britain would be hamstrung by the poor state of its government and finances as it tried to prevent the outbreak of another major war. This led to the infamous policy of appeasement, whereby the British and French would betray their allies in Central and Eastern Europe by giving their territory to Nazi Germany in an attempt to pacify their thirst for conquest. Whilst Britain's European neighbours were being slowly picked off by the Germans, British troops were forced to withdraw from across Egypt to the Suez Canal, a vital waterway which fed wealth from the British Raj, the crown jewel of the empire, back to the home islands. With the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Allies had no choice but to go to war with Germany and its allies, sparking the Second World War. Surprise incompetence from the Germans led to a disastrous defeat for Britain with the loss of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Danzig, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Yugoslavia and even France to the Axis powers by the summers of 1941. By the following year, Germany occupied almost all of Eastern Europe and Japan had launched its invasion of European and American colonies in Asia. Winston Churchill described the loss of Singapore as the worst disaster in British history. The Second World War would end in 1945 after a gruesome campaign against Italy in the south and Germany in the west and the nuclear bombings of Japan by the United States. The war left untold destruction across the world, with British military dead exceeding 460,000 men and civilians suffering through hell and back, notably the German Blitz of London and the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed over 3 million people in the Raj. Britain emerged from the ashes of this conflict as one of 3 superpowers in the brewing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was from this point forwards that the empire would crumble. 1947. 2 years have passed since the end of the Second World War, and the seeds of nationalism have begun to sprout in Britain's colonies, most notably India. Gandhi's peaceful protest movement, as well as rising international pressure and running costs, forced Britain to grant the Raj its independence, but not in the way you might expect. The British Raj was made up of dozens of princely states, territories, ethnic groups, religions and climate types, so dividing it would never be easy. As demanded by the Muslim League, the Raj would be split along religious lines between a Muslim and Hindu country, Pakistan and India. The partition was done hastily, leading to border disputes and violence that would claim the lives of 10 million people and set the Indian subcontinent up for a tense 20th century. The following year, Ceylon and Burma would each be granted their own independence separate from India, ending Britain's rule over South Asia. Over in the Middle East, Transjordan proclaimed its independence in 1946 with little resistance. However, its next-door neighbour, Mandatory Palestine, would be a trickier situation. Since the Balfour Declaration of 1916 declaring Britain's support for a Jewish state in Palestine, conflict had been brewing between the Muslim and Jewish segments of society. This accelerated after the Holocaust, with millions of Jews from around the world seeking safety in Palestine. Britain, deeming the situation too complex to handle, would withdraw from its mandate over Palestine in 1948, leaving it to the United Nations to decide its future. This same year, Britain would withdraw its troops from northwestern Germany and unite its occupation zone with that of the other Allied powers, forming West Germany. The 1950s would begin slowly, with Britain's 1951 withdrawal from Libya, a former Italian colony they had occupied after victory in World War II. By the middle of the decade, political instability in the Middle East led to the Egyptians declaring that all British troops were to leave from the Suez Canal zone and the canal would be nationalised. Unhappy with the threat this posed to their remaining positions in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the British and French would intervene alongside Israel in 1956. This staged invasion would fail and receive fierce international condemnation from both the United States and the Soviet Union, who threatened to use nuclear weapons should troops not be withdrawn. In a humiliating defeat, Britain, France and Israel would concede to international demands and retreat, cementing themselves as second-rank powers who would need the permission of the United States to act on the world stage. With this defeat clear for the world to see, decolonisation of Britain's empire would rapidly accelerate over the next decade. First Ghana in 1956, Malaya in 1957, Somaliland, Cyprus and Nigeria in 1960. Though Britain would maintain military bases in Cyprus, Sierra Leone, Kuwait, Tanganyika and Cameroon in 1961, and finally Uganda in 1962. In the Caribbean during the 1950s, Britain had formed the West Indies Federation as it deemed the tiny islands to be unsustainable by themselves. However, the political, geographic, economic and demographic reality led to the project's collapse, with some islands being reincorporated as crown colonies and some, such as Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, gaining independence in 1962. Britain's fatal fall from grace would continue from there. North Borneo, Sarawak and Singapore would be given to Malaya in 1963. Zanzibar would be given independence in 1963 and join Tanganyika in 1964 to form Tanzania. And Kenya would receive full independence in 1963 after the bloody Mau Mau uprising. Nyasaland, now Malawi, Malta and Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, would all gain independence in 1964, with the Gambia and the Maldives coming shortly the next year. Britain would flex its dwindling power in 1965 by placing Southern Rhodesia under blockade after it proclaimed independence under a racist apartheid government which was not internationally recognised. Guyana, Botswana, Lesotho and Barbados would gain independence in 1966, with South Yemen following the next year. 1968 saw Mauritius and Swaziland gain independence, as well as Nauru freed from the joint control of Australia and the UK. After Tonga and Oman gained independence in 1970, Bahrain, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates would achieve freedom in 1971. Then came the Bahamas in 1973, Grenada in 1974, the Seychelles in 1976, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, Dominica and St. Lucia in 1978, and Kiribati, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 1979. 1980 saw the lifting of the blockade on Southern Rhodesia as it transitioned to majority rule under the new name of Zimbabwe, as well as the independence of Vanuatu, which had been under joint British-French control. Then in 1981, Belize and Antigua and Barbuda proclaimed freedom. 1982 would prove a big year for the British, as they would prove their military prowess despite the loss of the majority of their empire. Argentina had long disputed control over the Falkland Islands as well as other holdings in the South Atlantic, inheriting a Spanish claim to the territories dating back centuries. Amongst political turmoil at home, the military junta would launch an invasion of the Falklands, assuming the British would just accept the loss. Unfortunately for Argentinians, accept the loss they would not. Despite pressure from the USA to leave the islands under Argentinian control, Britain responded fiercely with a large military task force that demonstrated their world-class naval power. The islands were retaken with relative ease and victory was secured, one sorely needed after Britain had lost the 3 Cod Wars to Iceland in 1961, 1975 and 1978. This victory could do little to avoid the final remnants of Britain's empire from drifting out of London's orbit, with St Kitts and Nevis leaving in 1983 and Brunei the following year. And in a strange twist of events, the people of Bermuda voted overwhelmingly against independence 3-1. Finally, Britain's lease over Hong Kong and the new territories was set to expire in 1997, a countdown the government had been anxiously watching since the treaty was signed in 1898. Negotiations earlier in the Cold War resulted in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which outlined how Hong Kong would be returned, setting the date of July 1st, 1997. Mere hours ago, the British Empire ended with the handover of Hong Kong. Despite this, Britain remains a formidable political, economic and military power, taking the number 2 rank in both the European Union and NATO, behind Germany and the United States respectively, while still keeping scattered territories across the globe. Although the sun has set on the British Empire, it will rise again over the United Kingdom, bringing a bright future ahead.